So first of all, I think these protests are remarkable, and it's a real watershed moment in the history of Iran and in the history of this regime, because I think it's kind of a space of before these protests and after in terms of how the public deals with the regime and vice versa. So typically, what the regime has done in the last 30 years is that every once in a while people have there've been reasons for people to get out of the streets and protest, and they have had heavy crackdowns. If you remember what happened in 2009,
Yep.
it was heavy crackdowns, and then they back down a bit. And that's been the dialogue that the public has had. This time around, the regime is going all out again in terms of the arrests and these long sentences for women and men, and as you say, the sham trials and so forth. And the executions, I think, it's really about trying to scare people back into their homes, because these protests are happening all over the country. It's, as you know, it's a lot of young people. And the real issue is that if they're protesting now about the issues that they care about, it's their ideology isn't going to change. So I think the regime understands that, and it's using the only tool it knows, which is violence and fear.
And that is working, because according to many experts, and I'm sure you see it as well, there is a remarkable, or rather a marked decrease in the number of these organized or flash protests, right?
Well, I think it's two things. One is that there are protests still happening. The question is whether we're hearing about them because of the internet connectivity. So, there's some days that I see more, and other days that I see less. The second thing is that even if the protests aren't happening, there is an understanding that the regime's legitimacy, whatever was left of it, has really diminished significantly. Anything they say, it's almost as if nobody believes them. And going back to the case of the
Akbari,
recent one that you were, Mr. Akbari, yes, Mr. Akbari, we were talking about. They say he's an MI6 spy. Most people are probably sitting there and saying, we don't believe that. He was obviously a reformist politician, so maybe the signaling was to the reformists to sort of get in line with the regime. So there is definitely a legitimacy question that's there,
okay,
even if the public demonstrations are fewer.
Do you think, Akbari's execution leads me to a question about what should the West do? Because, there's a whole plethora of, trying to step up sanctions, trying to particularly target sanctions, calling in and démarching diplomats, and a big call for Westerners certainly to remove their ambassadors from Iran. Do you think one of the Iranian regime's reasons for the execution of Akbari was to tell the West to back off?
Well, if it's trying to tell I think it's trying to tell the West that it's business as usual, however macabre that might sound. Mm-hmm. But if it's trying to tell the West to back off, it's certainly backfired, because the British are now coming on much more strongly about sanctions or putting the IRGC on the terrorist list. So I think that there is definitely the tensions are there, and the West is also dealing with its very vocal Iranian diaspora population, as we see in Canada and in Europe. And so, on the one hand, they're responding to the domestic audience, the Iranian diaspora. On the other hand, they're trying to figure out how to engage with in the Iranian setting. And from my work, when I think about Iran and I think about Afghanistan and other places where I work, which is fragile conflict areas, often not in the news, the lack of diplomatic involvement, or the lack of diplomatic presence, is actually detrimental to the cause and to the people that are on the ground. So I certainly don't ascribe to this idea of kicking out all the ambassadors or pulling out all the diplomats. I think we need a much more concerted diplomatic presence on the ground in terms of the issues that they're dealing with, and these cases, if they can go to trial, to the courts, if they can go visit prisoners, raising things like the death sentence and so forth. So I'd like to see much more robust diplomatic presence and use of that West presence on the ground. The other point I just want to make on this is that the West is one side of the story, but there are other countries that have diplomatic missions. Mexico, Latin Americans. Mexico has a feminist foreign policy. What does that mean in its dealings with Iran? And and it's important because, again, when you look at Iran and Afghanistan, it's only a year and a half ago that that essentially the U.S. handed Afghan women and their lives into the hands of the Taliban. So the credibility of the West and certainly NATO countries is fairly limited right now in terms of standing up for women's rights.
So let me ask you about women's rights, because, you know, one of the real problems, and I mentioned it, and this is what you're concerned about as well, is that there has been really a lot of credible reporting and eyewitnesses abuse of these detained women. I mean, the details and the stories are, you know, you just almost can't believe them. And for an Islamic country, so-called, to engage in this sexual abuse of women who they say they're trying to protect, you know, I mean, where does this end? What leverage does anybody have to prevent these women being abused in the terrible way that they're being abused right now?
It's absolutely horrific. It's been going on for decades, as we know. I mean, these are not new incidences, unfortunately, in terms of the regime's handling of people. I think the fact that we are now talking about it and more people are willing to come out and tell their stories and lift the veil, if you want, metaphorically, on these issues is really important, because you know, this idea that under an Islamic setting, women are valued and protected and so forth is absolute nonsense. It's nonsense there. It's nonsense in Afghanistan. It's nonsense in other countries. The hypocrisy has to be addressed, and they have to be brought forward into the international setting if they want to be part of the international community. We have laws around these things. We have 10 Security Council resolutions that talk about the issues of women's right to be involved in politics, but also protection and sexual violence being a particular issue that is addressed. So it's time for it to be brought out and you know, let them answer these questions.
So let me ask you this, because you talked about a conversation that sometimes happens between demonstrations and crackdown. So now the so-called supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, tweeted last week that hijab is obligatory in the religious laws, and there's no doubt about this, but those who don't fully observe the hijab should not be accused of being irreligious or against the revolution. They take part in certain religious or revolutionary ceremonies with enthusiasm and eagerness. So he's obviously shifting his public demeanor, probably because women insisting still on going out, some of them anyway, without the hijab. So what actually is happening? And do you believe the argument between factions of the establishment is actually weakening the regime's grip or not?
So I think, number one, this question of the status of women in Iran has always been central to the ideology of this regime. And women have been the first ones, and to this day, the last ones to be out, you know, protesting, resisting, non-violently, in all sorts of ways for 40 years. So generation after generation has been resisting this thing. What's interesting this time is that for the first time in history, actually, even globally, we're seeing a revolution that's not only led by women, but the message of women's rights, women life, freedom, is the clarion call for everybody, for the men to join in across ethnic and religious lines and so forth. And I think the regime is struggling with that. It's actually quite interesting. It reminds me of the story from the Shahnameh where this, you know,
30 seconds.
Yeah, Ghorda Farid dresses as a man, goes to fight. Sohrab lifts her veil, and she says to him, "If you win from me, you've won from a woman. If you beat me, you've beaten a woman." This is the dilemma that the regime is facing, and they don't know what to do. Yeah. So the support, the attention is really, really critical carrying on for right now. It's absolutely essential.
We have got to keep the spotlight on. So thank you.